Hi, everyone. My name is Kinjal. Thanks for being here today. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about liquidity, L2s, scaling, all of the fun and interesting topics that we've got going on. Maybe if you guys could just start with intros, that would be great. And also just like the role you play in the L2 space.
Sure. Do you want me to go first?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, go for it.
Hi, I'm Arjun. I'm one of the founders of Connext. Connext is an interoperability protocol that basically connects like different L2 ecosystems to each other within the Ethereum ecosystem. We've been working in this space since 2017, mostly focused on scalability research. When we realized that there was this like really pressing need to allow scalability solutions on Ethereum to be able to talk to each other. And as it turns out, scalability and interoperability are really kind of two sides of the same coin. So that's it's sort of like a good transition to get to, and I think that's going to be what a lot of people start talking about in the next few months.
Hey, I'm Tarun. I'm founder of a company called Gauntlet. We do risk management for DeFi protocols, both on layer 2 and the base layer. This sort of involves kind of doing analysis to figure out what interest rates should look like, or margin requirements, and things of that sort. And covering kind of risk in layer 2s is quite related to their security, so that's sort of what we focus on.
Rich Rosenblum, one of the founders of GSR. We got started in 2013 in the space. We're a trader, market maker, investor, and a lot of us came from the traditional trading side, so it's been fantastic to be in the space this long, to see the evolution and how things are moving faster and getting more efficient on the trading side. Our clients are many of the top issuers and L2s in the space, and so we've been working with them to see how we could scale the next 10 trillion of the industry.
Awesome, thank you. Maybe if we just can start high level. There's obviously a lot of conversations about L2s this year. I think it's really come into the spotlight in a way that we haven't really seen previously. How would you kind of break down the current landscape of L2 side chains, layer 1s, like just the entire landscape in general? What's the lay of the land right now? Anybody want? Yeah, go for it.
So I'd say this is one of the first panels where we've had a few minutes beforehand to discuss, and I think it's one of the more open-ended kind of topics, and struggled to come up with an analogy for L2s in general. But L1s, you could say it's the database layer. Liken it to Ethereum being like New York City, where the data are the people, and one of the issues has become transportation, how to get the people around seamlessly. And maybe 50 years ago when the subway started, it was a fantastic solution, but as you add more people, you need more forms of transportation, where the transportation I would liken towards the L2s. So you'd have mission-focused ways like the subway, you can get north to south, or maybe across the bridge. But as you get more people and more needs to move around, you need newer solutions that could get people around fast and cheaply.
I guess one thing I'd say is, the evolution of computers historically has always had this sort of cache hierarchy, and different types of compute are used for different types of purposes, specialized towards different, more memory-specific needs or more compute-specific needs. And basically what you're seeing with layer 2s is kind of the, von Neumann Harvard architecture, but applied to chains versus having a single sort of state machine for everything. And I think that realization that you kind of have to specialize the same way that, computers have been specialized historically is a pretty big step. I think we'll also see a lot of hardware improvements tied to layer 2s, especially in terms of zero-knowledge proof generation. And so there's a lot of technological upgrades happening at the layer 2 space. And of course, Arjun has to know of all of them, so he probably can give a good view of them.
It's a lot of pressure. I mean, I think like something that we like kind of broadly talk about layer 2 as like this bigger ecosystem of types of things that include some things that we've historically called layer 2s, and now some other things that are not really layer 2s. They're other chains, but like we're kind of using them as scalability layers. And like I think there's two reasons for that. One is like people just really hate adopting standards. It's something that we've kind of come to learn over the course of the last few years. And I think the other reason is that, as Tarun said, there's sort of a big need to like you don't necessarily need to have the highest security set of validators validating every single thing. I think it makes sense for a lot of DeFi to exist in places where it's validated by the biggest validator sets, things like Ethereum. But if you're building like lower value applications, doesn't really make a lot of sense to like push all of that onto Ethereum, even if you're using things like rollups. And I think that there's a lot of like really interesting space to work there, but the difficulty is just going to be like how users and application developers can get to the point where they understand that like what those trade-offs are and like what the effective security of the system that they're on is. Yeah.
How do you, I mean, on that point, if you were, a developer coming into the space or a builder, how do you imagine they're supposed to navigate like the liquidity question? Everything is kind of being fragmented across all these different solutions. What's like the evolution of that, and what would you do?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. From the conversations that we've had with developers, like they're extremely confused. So, I think a big part of this is just going to come down to having like the right kinds of abstractions. Like one of the things that we're trying to do is like make it so that developers and users don't really need to know what chain domain they're on, ideally getting to the point where like it's easier for people to evaluate. But yeah, the reality is that like for a while it's probably going to be those of us that have been in the industry for a while advocating for what kinds of things people should be using, and like we sort of have the moral imperative to do that because it would be really easy for us to be like, no, all of these things have the same security, and people would just believe it. So yeah, it's a little bit of a tightrope walk.
Yeah, definitely.
One thing I think maybe making an analogy to traditional finance, I think of the bridges the way I think of like microwave towers versus fiber optics in high frequency trading. They're really kind of the gateway between locked, isolated places that sort of can only communicate sort of properties of their liquidity via these interconnects. I forget what the name of the movie is, but there's this recent movie about the war in like the early 2000s for the New York to Chicago link, which ended up being won by Microwave Towers by McKay Brothers. And bridges are kind of very similar. If we look at the participants who are building bridges right now, there are technologists and then there are trading firms. And so there's a reason that from a liquidity standpoint, trading firms really care about bridge quality and also bridge latency. And so, I think part of the curse of fragmented liquidity is that you basically need a lot more arbitrage to keep prices synchronized. On the other hand, being able to run the bridge means you can do that more efficiently. And so we're seeing that sort of in these different ecosystems where some parties are kind of focusing on bridge building, some parties are focused on kind of bridge arbitrage, things like that. Something worth thinking about. And maybe as a thought experiment, imagine sort of Ethereum where every single transaction on Ethereum mainnet is just processing a layer 2. So it's just sort of sequencing like the order in which these other transactions sort of achieve finality. There is a world where Ethereum really ends up like that, where it really is just like the final metadata settlement layer. It doesn't do anything else.
I'd say one of the main issues is around interoperability. It's hard to have true interoperability as it's such a fast and rapidly evolving and growing space. I think whether it's an L1 looking for L2 or a user looking for the right L2, it's important, I think, to pick what most aligns with your needs, but as well as have a backup, since in the regulatory environment and everything is changing, it's hard to assume there's going to be continuity. So I think if you at least have something else that you can work with seamlessly, or that your project or ecosystem works with, it'll give you a bit more staying power.
I think one of the questions that I have about getting onboarded into the L2 world is just the user experience. I think it can be really confusing. I'm curious as to like, if you imagine, like you mentioned this before, Arjun, that eventually people won't know really what chain they're using, or they'll just kind of yeah, they could be using multiple different products or multiple different chains and not even understand that what's happening kind of behind the scenes. And it's very similar to how we use the internet today, right? We don't really know what's happening in the plumbing, or at least like the average person doesn't. But it feels like we're far away from that. So I guess like what do you imagine is like the next step to get closer to that sort of reality, and like how do we get to this idea of interoperability from here? Which I know is a crazy question, but what do you guys think is like the next steps?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think something to consider is that like over the long term, what we've seen is that there are two things that seem to be prioritized within this space. Trust minimization actually matters. Like we've seen over and over again, like lots and lots of projects will like compromise on that, and then in the long term game, they will just like lose because of it. I think like that's something that people don't really think about a lot, is like we're not building these protocols for, for them to be like extremely valuable in 5 years. We're building them so that they're around in 100 years. And that only happens when they are actually decentralized, actually trust minimized. I think the other thing that will matter a lot is like extensibility. So where can these protocols, like if you build an interoperability protocol, where can it actually go? And like I would say like the direction that the interoperability space is going is that like we have this massive fragmentation happening because everyone and their mother is launching an interop protocol or a bridge. Most of them obviously don't really understand the like security implications of bridging in the first place, but still it's like an important data point. And I think like we're going to have to see like a certain amount of consolidation, right? Like people are going to say like these are the models that work, these are the ones that don't work. And I don't see any situation where it doesn't work out, where people are like, okay, well of course we're going to go after the ones that have less trust, and that can be deployed to many, many, many chains.
I guess UX-wise, one of the kind of more annoying things right now is you have to just sign so many transactions to use bridges. The most favorable UX right now is on Cosmos, because in IBC you can sign a single transaction and move anywhere in the network. And so I think one thing that people are going to have to get used to is figuring out how to bundle atomically transactions on both sides of a bridge in a layer 2 to make sure that the user doesn't have to keep clicking yes. Like I don't think we talked about high value versus low value applications. The lower the value of the application, the less the user cares about, like, the less the user will tolerate having to click the button 10 times. And so I think working on solutions to that is going to actually look a little bit more like DeFi, in that we're already starting to see this, where people are making synthetic assets that have only one transaction that kind of combine and replicate doing many operations at once. And I think we're going to see a lot more UX innovation of that form, which will lead to a lot of new sort of DeFi protocols to service these synthetic assets.
Just to follow up on that, like I think that's honestly like the biggest thing that we see with our users and stuff as well, is just like what is the pain of having to go to an actual bridge UI or to something to go across chains, because then you have this like cognitive burden of being like, okay, I'm going across chains now. But really, like that goes away when you start integrating directly into the wallets and you start like having more control over this signing experience, so that like, I think the ideal end state is like, you're using MetaMask or something to use an application, and like you don't really even need to know what chain you're on. All you do is like when you sign the confirmation, it just has an additional line item in the receipt which says like this is your cross-chain transaction fee in addition to your gas fee. And like people ideally can like edit it and do more advanced things, but still it's like bundled up in a way where like you don't really need to care unless you have to, or you don't have to care unless you want to. Sorry.
It's a bit uninspiring of a view, but I think that whether it's 5 or 10 years, I think we're going to see extreme consolidation. The same way with traditional tech, you have one place you go for the search, one place you go for social media. I think that when you have a scale of billions or 10 plus billion people in 10 years, you're going to have decentralized aspects underneath, but there's going to be only a few groups that have the funding and the scale to give a really premium user experience. And today, in the same way, people say they hate a particular internet or social media company, they still use it overwhelmingly and more hours per day, despite what people say. So I think that just due to the massive global scale we'll need, I think you'll see more consolidation than people expect over the next decade.
Yeah, and Rich, I'm curious on your perspective. So you're working with a lot of the emerging L2 solutions, right, and helping with liquidity. How do you see this consolidation occurring? Is it going to be this like slow evolution of people just ultimately not being able to bootstrap, or like what does that look like in your mind?
I think it's still early in the process. I think that we're still seeing some entrepreneurs come out with great ideas that could revolutionize the space. So while I mentioned 10 years, I think 5 years out, we could still see even more projects out there than are today. There's certainly enough funding and appetite to use new solutions, but then once you go out 10, I think that's the point where we really start to have that consolidation. And whether Solana, talking about L1, Solana is the MySpace or the Facebook. I think it's still early in the process, and there's going to be groups with even a bigger funding, more connectivity, and I think echo what he mentioned about the user experience. That's the part that's completely lacking. I think that users are looking at the nuts and bolts of a system, but once there's a beautiful, seamless user experience, I think that's the group that will really take over.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. We've talked a little bit about the risks, but I would love to go a little deeper on the security side of things and trust minimization and just like the trade-offs that exist today when you're thinking about L2s. What would be, could you just break down what some of those considerations are and how you would incorporate that into your decision when you're picking an L2?
Right. Yeah, it's so. I mean, I'm sure everybody knows about the scalability trilemma at this stage because it's been something that's been beaten to death. Interoperability, by the way, also has a similar trilemma. You have to choose between like the extensibility of the system, the trust minimization of the system, or like the generalizability of being able to like port around generalized data. And I think it's like important to pay attention to that because even though it's been beaten to death, people don't really note that like, okay, you can't actually have blockchains that are operating at the cost that many of them are operating at, right? Like you can't physically scale global consensus that way. There are always trade-offs. So I think like I'm glad that things like Arbitrum and Optimism are live within the Ethereum ecosystem. I guess we have yet to see a lot of like layer 2 stuff outside of Ethereum, but at least it's giving people the opportunity to see what those trade-offs are in the real world. And to interact with like systems that will not necessarily have like, consensus failures because they're producing so much state. And I think that's like a really critical trade-off that developers are going to have to like take a look at soon.
I mean, I guess if we were trying to make a classification of the different types of layer 2s, and apologies to people who don't like the sidechain versus layer 2 debate, but you have sort of systems where the actual data is stored on the base layer, but the computation is done externally, so that's Arbitrum and Optimism. You have systems that are sidechains, so that's like the Blockstream LBTC type of thing that is Matic, anything like that, which relies on basically locking up capital and slashing people for sort of misappropriately validating transactions or forwarding transactions to the remote machine that's executing things. And then, of course, yes, the last thing is sort of this peer-to-peer state channel-based mechanism. So all three of them have sort of trade-offs in who actually stores the data, who actually has to lock up capital and be sort of like an insurer effectively, and also sort of who does the computation. And those three tasks so far have been divided up differently, and it really is not clear whether the kind of economic security model of the insurance style thing of like I have to stake a bunch of capital, and as long as enough people kind of observe me when I do malicious behavior, the state is valid, is sufficient, or whether we actually really do need this type of thing where we have to store the data and in kind of the slowest, safest layer. A lot of bridges that people use today are really single addresses, for better or worse, and you're really trusting the developers. But, oh yeah, I did actually forget one other type of bridge, which is the Intel, sort of the secure enclave style bridge, where the validators do lock up some capital on both sides, so they can get slashed on either chain. But the actual transaction processing happens in sort of the secure enclave, so they don't exactly know what the transactions look like. A thought experiment I want to leave you with when you think about the risks of these systems is imagine if there is more extractable value than Intel's market cap in cross-chain layer 2 transactions. Will Intel destroy its business to hack SGX, its own system, which it does have microcode instructions for?
Yeah, that is a very, very good question. I think it's the same sort of key question around like a lot of the protocols that are in the ecosystem right now that are like, well, the security of our system relies on the fact that in the future, we'll be making a bunch of money from the protocol. So therefore, it's a secure protocol because in the future, it will be a secure protocol.
Supply chain attacks are very hard to price in.
Yeah, it's the chicken and the egg kind of issue, right? We will be secure because we'll have liquidity, but we need to get liquidity and
To become
secure.
It's always also really important to like remember. I mean, really like what it comes down to when you're using any bridge, when you're using any L2 system, is to just ask like who is actually verifying these transactions? Is it being like which validator set is actually the one that is taking these and agreeing that this actually happened, and how corruptible are they? So, if you go like the security maximalist perspective, like Bitcoin, Ethereum have by far the most like economic security, so you want to have them be used to validate transactions that like are extremely high value or like a very high volume of them. And in the case of things like sidechains, you have an external validator set that is responsible for making all of this happen, and that external validator set could rug you. And in some cases, people are okay with that. Like in some cases, you might already trust the external validator set, like Binance Chain. And then in other cases, you might just not really realize that that's the case. You might not realize that like that side chain, which is operating as a chain, is really just like 3 nodes run by the same person. And that really squarely falls into the bridge, into the bridge space as well. Like a lot of interoperability protocols have the exact same kind of trade-off space where there's like a group of validators running what is effectively a multi-sig, moving value across chains, and then if that group of validators like colludes, those funds are lost. And of course, it's much more easy to bribe that group of validators than it is to bribe, Ethereum miners or Bitcoin miners.
Yeah, one other thing to consider is sort of the regulatory risk of the smaller validator set, in that it's much easier for regulators to probably regulate bridges and cross-chain transactions than it is to regulate the base layer ones, due to the sheer amount of capital that's locked into the layer ones versus the amount of capital that's in both the bridges and in layer 2 solutions. And a kind of another kind of comparison. Again, in my mind, I always think of bridges in terms of, microwave towers, cross-exchange connects. And if you look at the microwave towers, they initially were owned by one person, but then became a consortium because regulators said you can't have one person own the bridge. So I imagine kind of something similar will happen. I mean, regulators aren't exactly the most technically savvy right now, but give them 10 years, they might catch up to where things are right now.
Could say the opposite though, and if recent history continues, the bigger players are bigger targets for regulators, so you could have a disturbance if you're using one of the largest, because they could suddenly had an interruption of service due to regulatory climate getting more strict.
I guess it's just like hard to imagine Bitcoin or Ethereum themselves being able to really be censored versus Solana, pretty easy to imagine it being censored.
Right.
Matic, pretty easy to imagine it being censored. Optimism, Arbitrum, all of these things are extremely easy to imagine being censored. Right. It's a very small number of entities that.
Yeah. I mean, we just haven't had the time yet to get to the point where like our threat model for a lot of those other systems has evolved, because we're sort of like in like, crypto peacetime right now. And I think a lot of people who have been in this space for a while have had like the experience of seeing like what can actually happen when you have like regulations, and also have like the kind of like cypherpunk ethos of like, okay, well, you know, you have to consider who your adversaries are. You know, is your adversary, like, what happens if your adversary is like Jeff Bezos and he could just buy your chain? Like he could just individually run enough validators to like 51% attack your chain. And like that's a really good question, right? That's
I think Equinix and AWS probably could very much 75% attack Solana right now. If you look at actually the IPs that validators are using, it's a very small number of data centers.
right. And yeah, like I think it really just comes down to that resilience point, right? Like people kind of forget that like where a lot of this space came from was like the original peer-to-peer file sharing wars, where you know, there was kind of like this peacetime period where like peer-to-peer file sharing protocols exploded, right? There were just hundreds of them, and many of them scaled really fast. Like some of them got like 80-90% market share over the course of like a few months. Like I'm thinking of things like LimeWire and like Nutella and things like that, and like all of them died. And the reason that all of them died was that none of them were actually resilient. BitTorrent was the only one that was sort of like the short kid on the block and like didn't really have a lot of adoption for a very, very long period of time. But they took the perspective of like, okay, well, we just want to make this one extremely uncensorable. We want to make sure that like there's really no centralized actors. We're not really providing any service here. It's an open network of people who are able to do transfer between each other. And once it exists, the cat's out of the bag and it can't be stopped. And that's why it still exists today. Not really sure how being acquired by Tron fits into that picture, but let's just ignore that part.
Yeah, it feels like everything that we're building today, we really need to like see it through for the next decade to truly understand where we're going to end up, because time is like the one thing we can't really factor into the equation right now. Yeah, so we'll see what kind of happens. I guess just as the last question, as we wrap things up, how, or not, maybe not how, but like what would be your preferred L2 solution today? Like if you have one, like what's your, I mean, I'm basically asking you to pick like a favorite kid, but
Oh man.
yeah, like
This is the hardest for him.
you know,
Yeah,
I know. I mean, maybe not like your favorite kid, but yeah, like what's to you, like what's the leading solution out there?
yeah. I mean, I think like people are developing the intuition now that like ZK rollups give the best set of trade-offs. And it's you know, and I think like most scalability solutions these days, at least in the Ethereum ecosystem, are like have like broad plans to head in that direction if they're not already heading that direction. And the reason is literally just that like running side chains means bootstrapping your own validator set. That is actually a lot of work. And maintaining it. Running an optimistic rollup means having to have this like 7-day withdrawal window and having to like post data to chain, deal with all of these other problems, which is also a lot of work. Whereas from an operational standpoint, running a ZK rollup is not as bad. Like you do have to like decentralize the sequencer and things like that, but it's not like it really gives you the best set of trust and user experience trade-offs that you can get. So I would say like we're not there yet, but when the ZK rollups do start going live, I think that's when we'll start seeing a lot of the magic happen within the ecosystem.
I think, yeah, I kind of agree. Optimistic rollups in general are kind of a crutch. But I'm a little more pessimistic on the ZK rollup side, not because they aren't kind of the best solution, but more that, you know, from 2017 to the last cycle, funded almost all of the improvements in zero-knowledge proofs. We had this kind of Moore's law exponential improvement in zero-knowledge proving time and verification time in a bunch of different algorithms. But that's flatlined very sharply over the last year. And I don't think we're actually going to get to the scale that people want for rollups without building custom hardware and ASICs.
Right.
And there's very little investment in that right now. And so I think I would put the ZK time scale at the 5 to 10 year time scale, not at the 2 to 3 year, in spite of kind of people raising a lot of money for the software side of things, because we have kind of hit some fundamental limits. But in terms of something, I think today that you should try is definitely, I was shocked at how nice the Cosmos experience is right now. Kind of amazing.
Yeah, Cosmos is very, very cool.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for taking the time today. I think we're at time. Yeah, great conversation, and thank you all for listening.